Hi, everyone. So we are going to be continuing our lesson on the founding of the United States. And today we are going to talk about the American Revolution, the central document that is behind the American Revolution. And so we're going to watch a quick video first, before we start the lesson.
The Declaration of Independence, for me, is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever seen.
It's a revolutionary document for a revolutionary statement.
You cannot help but be stirred when you read those words.
Thomas Jefferson's writing is absolutely magnificent. And when he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That was the first time anybody had bothered to write that down.
And then you turn the clock back and think of when he was writing, how young he was, what a statement it was given the history of the world at that point. And you feel the excitement of being on the cusp of something so profound that it's hard to put it into words.
If you review our Declaration of Independence, it has those beautiful words about all men are created equal and governments are formed among men to represent the people. It was a good statement of what we were all about. And that's the only thing people remember about the Declaration of Independence, that it was about all men are created equal. But it's really roughly a 28 count indictment against King George. And therefore, because of the way in which the British Crown treated us, we now declare that we are a free country, and we want to let you know why. Now, if we're going to have a war, we're going to have a war.
In 1776, you have the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, debating a unified position for the colonies with respect to the hostilities that have already broken out. And the fundamental issue between them is, are they fighting for their rights as Englishmen within the British Empire, or are they going to fight for independence? And they're seriously divided. People who are perfectly willing to resist the tyranny of the British government are not necessarily willing to strike for independence. But there's a groundswell in favor of it, I think, in large measure because they recognize that having provoked the lion this far, there's no going back.
All of a sudden you have this group of people who are going, no, we're not part of some great chain of being with the king at the top of it. We are free people. We can vote for who we want to have in charge. And we're not going to tolerate you telling us that we have some class status we have to be trapped in. It says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, meaning that Parliament in London, the King himself, the courts cannot interfere and take away your rights because the state can't take power from us. Even to this day, it's probably the most central difference between America and every other country in the world.
It goes well beyond what was needed in order to declare independence. It establishes a philosophical basis for a civil democracy in which all persons are guaranteed rights by virtue of their personhood.
This political genius, not just in Jefferson, but in Adams and all the other people who collected here, they saw a new time for humankind, which is that we can be free and that we can make decisions for ourselves.
Right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to talk about its effects, right? So what were some of the effects of this document? First was, obviously, the colonies declared independence from Britain in 1776. That didn't mean that at the time the colonies had gained their independence. They still obviously had a war to fight, but it was 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was issued. So as a result of the war later, Britain did ultimately recognize the United States independence. And George Washington emerged as a leader of the United States. So let's do a little bit of an activity here. I want you to describe who and what you see in this picture. So what do you think they're doing? And also think about like who is not represented in the picture. So I'll post the picture and make sure to rewatch this if you need to. And I want you to just respond to those questions. So we have John Adams, Roger Sherman, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. And they're presenting the document standing before John Hancock, the President of the Continental Congress. So this one right here is John Adams. This right here is Roger Sherman. This is Thomas Jefferson. And there's Benjamin Franklin. And those men, they are saying they're presenting the Declaration of Independence to John Hancock, who was the president of the Continental Congress, and he's famous for writing his signature on the Declaration. It was a very large signature, like it was the largest of all of them. And so actually that's why we have this saying today when you say, can I get your John Hancock, you're basically saying, can I get your signature? Can you sign this, please? Because it was such an over-exaggerated large signature that it became famous after that. So we're going to talk about the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, the creation of it. So there were a committee of 5. It was including those men and Robert Livingston that were on the previous picture. So John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. It was mainly written by Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams. And they began writing it while the Continental Congress debated separating from Britain. And the president, again, of the Continental Congress was John Hancock. So there's that famous picture. So the committee, that we just mentioned, the important thing to remember is that those were all well-educated white men. So who was left out from this committee from the very beginning? Right? African Americans, there were no women, no working class, and no loyalists, of course, no one loyal to the crown of England, loyal to the king, and no Native Americans were represented. So you have to understand this is how the founding document was written. It has a perspective, just like we were talking about perspectives last week. And as a result of this fact that they were all well-educated white men, there's a certain perspective that you can see in the Declaration that maybe it might have been a different document. It might have looked a little bit different had others who weren't represented had a chance to collaborate and work on it as well. So voting rights, those who were allowed to vote according to the Declaration or to the early Constitution, were white male property owners. So when we're talking about in the Declaration of Independence, all men were created equal, that idea of equality changed. It wasn't like we think of equality today. Jefferson, when he declared all men are created equal in the document, he meant that all free citizens are political equals and free male citizens, right? So it didn't actually mean equality to all. That's not how it was practiced. Of course, today, that's how we interpret it, and it's evolved. Its meaning to us has evolved, but originally it wasn't that way. So the Declaration of Independence was signed, right, July 4th. That's why we have 4th of July, 1776. And it explained basic human rights and addressed their grievances against King George III. So it's an explanation of why the colonies were declaring independence. And it was based on, again, those Enlightenment ideals and ideas of John Locke and English philosophers that we discussed in the previous part of the lesson, the earlier part of the lesson. John Locke and other English philosophers wrote that people have natural rights like life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson, in the Declaration, he changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But you can see he found inspiration directly from those English philosophers like John Locke, those Enlightenment philosophers. The Declaration also was meant to explain to the nations of the world the reasons for seeking independence from Britain, because the American colonists, they were hoping to get support from other nations. And as we should remember from 8th grade, one of the most significant allies that the colonists end up recruiting is France. And that is because France and Britain have had a long history, rivalry. And they even had a war just a couple decades before. So they were seen as intense rivals at the time. And this document that the colonists had put out, this Declaration of Independence, it wasn't just to bash the king and to explain to Britain why they wanted independence, but it was also to explain to countries around the world why they were wanting independence and why they should support this independence movement. So this is one of the most famous parts of the Declaration, and it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Again, equal back then does not mean the same as what we think of equality today. It meant free citizens, so not slaves, and they really meant property owners who could vote, right? So all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable, cannot be taken away, remember from our earlier in the lesson. That among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And that was what Jefferson, he took from John Locke and he kind of twisted it, changed it a little bit, and made it his own. That to secure these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men. So governments find their authority from men, from the people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, right? So they're basically saying whenever a government infringes on these rights that are natural and cannot be taken away, it is the right of the people to alter that government or to abolish it. So this line is important because it's basically the colonists telling the British government that they believe that they have the right to revolt, to have a revolution, because the government is not upholding its other end of the contract, that social contract that we learned about earlier, right? That they believe their rights are being infringed upon and taken away, and they're not supposed to be taken away. They're unalienable rights. So they believe they have this right to revolt and to institute a new government, to create a new government, which would become the United States. So I do want to emphasize a couple things before we answer this question. So again, the colonists believed, and this is in the Declaration, that if the government does not protect their rights, the people can overthrow that government and create a new one that does. Jefferson declared all men are created equal, though he meant all free citizens were political equals. Not everybody, right? Just free male citizens. So today we have a different interpretation of what that means, and we'll talk about it later. And to emphasize again, the Declaration listed all the wrongs committed by the king toward America that violated their unalienable rights and created the United States. So what I'm going to have you do is I want you to respond to this question. Remember, you need to write a paragraph summary. So change this question into your topic sentence. So I'll give you an example. So the question says, what were the key values and or beliefs that led to the American Revolution? You should start your paragraph by saying some of the key values and or beliefs that led to the American Revolution are, and then select some of them from the the lesson from the presentation, make sure to review. I have the slides up for you. Go back, and you need to select some of those ideas and values that led to the American Revolution, and you need to explain how they led to the American Revolution. So it needs to be a paragraph. So 5 to 6 sentences total, and make sure that you are writing an adequate amount. I'm going to end up taking points off if it's just like one sentence or two. It needs to be a paragraph. So remember to do that. And then let me know if you have any questions, and then I'll see you in our next lesson. Thank you.